please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Murray.
Well, Pete was quoting from my own favorite book, and I'm instant best friends with anybody who likes In Pursuit. Actually, I'm instant best friends with anybody who likes any of my books, but especially In Pursuit. I spent all afternoon going over my presentation, and I'm happy to say that it times out at 2.5 hours. Since I only have 25 minutes, I'm going to have to excise a lot of it. So one thing I'm excising is Donald Trump. You are going to hear not a word about Donald Trump. There's a lot that is appropriate for you to be discussing regarding what he stands for, how he came to power, what it means for conservatism, but I'm not going to deal with any of that. I'm going to stick to the topic of the American project, and specifically the ways in which it is in danger of coming to an end. I suppose that it's appropriate for me to define what I mean myself by the American project. To me, it is the idea, begun with the founding, and the determination to test whether people as individuals, as families, and as communities can be left alone to live their lives as they see fit, as long as they allow the same freedom to everyone else, with the government providing a safe environment for those endeavors, but otherwise standing aside. And for the first couple of 100 years of this country, we did a pretty good job. We've had lots of defects, with slavery being the most obvious, but we made a lot of progress. And I think for the last 50 years, we have been going backwards until we are now at the point where we have a kind of class society which we have never had before. Because the fact is that everybody in this room, I imagine just about, is living his or her life pretty much the way you see fit. The government does get in our way sometimes, but we have the economic resources or the social resources or the administrative resources to fend off the government from making much trouble for us. That is not true for a great deal of American society. They are not left alone to live their lives as they see fit, and in fact, in many ways, it is getting harder and harder for them to do so. That is not what the American experiment was all about. The revolutionary aspect of the founding of America was that it said the pursuit of happiness is not to be left to a privileged elite. It is to be open to all. And that is what I think is we are in danger of losing. What I'm going to do is first set out a framework for the way I think about it, all right? The problem of assessing whether we're making progress or sliding back in social policy. Then I'm going to take stock of where we are, and then I'm going to give a few suggestions for what I think must be done in the conservative movement, or for that matter, the classical liberal movement or libertarian movement, or whichever aspect of the right you're talking about. In all of these cases, I'm throwing out suggestions. I'm going to have to do so very briefly, but we'll have a chance during the Q&A to flesh some of those out. First, the framework. And the framework comes straight from In Pursuit. It draws first upon an analysis of what are the enabling conditions for the pursuit of happiness. And by happiness, I'm using an Aristotelian framework, which I translate into happiness as lasting and justified satisfaction with life as a whole. Very uncontroversial definition. I can't even tell you who initiated that wording. It's very common in the analysis of Aristotle's ethics and the implications of it. And those enabling conditions are drawn from Abraham Maslow, starting with the proposition that people who are starving cannot pursue happiness, and saying that you must acquire a sufficient amount of material resources, that once you have those, the next thing you really need is safety from predators, whether they are in primitive societies, the animals outside the walls of the village, or in more advanced societies, the predators within the walls. After safety, there is a need for self-respect, a sense of measuring up internally. After that, there is, and I'm not sure about the order of these things here, but after that in Maslow's hierarchy comes the need for intimate relationships, of which, in my view, the richest is a good marriage. in my view, a good heterosexual marriage, but my wife and I have a sufficient number of gay friends who are engaged in relationships that sure look to us like good marriages as well. And finally, there is self-fulfillment. Expressing that which is within you that you are capable of doing as well as you can do it. And you know, I'm not going to go to the wall saying Maslow had everything exactly right. That does pretty much seem to cover it for me, the kinds of things that people need to reach the age I'm at and look back at who they have been and what they have done and take satisfaction in it. Now, the question then becomes, as far as public policy is concerned, what does government have to do with any of this? And to me, there are 4 domains within which people pursue these various things. And for 30 years now, I've been challenging audiences to name a 5th for me. And some people have named some, but oddly enough, I've rejected every single one of them as being adequate. The 4 are family, vocation, community, and faith. Interesting point. In pursuit, I just talk about family, vocation, and community. And I have a passing reference to faith, but say, well, this is a secular book, so I'm not going to go into that. I will also say that over the years, and I'm not saying this is because I'm at a Christian college, it is something that I have said in many settings and written something about as well. I am more and more convinced that faith is not only one of the 4, it is one of the 4 which has gotten the shortest shrift in terms of the attention paid to its importance by social science over the last 50 years. When I say that those 4 domains are the only way to do it, and by the way, vocation, I'm willing to cut a little slack and say avocations can also serve that function. It says to me that the role of government is to make sure that those 4 domains are rich and vital institutions through which these things can be achieved. Vital communities, vital vocational pursuits, a vital environment for faith, and a vital environment for families. And it is here where I think if you go through the list of accomplishments or failures of the federal government and state governments, for that matter, over the last 50 years, every single one of them has been ravaged. Let's just go through a list of some of the things we are facing now. I'm not going to talk a lot about causes. I have strong opinions about causes. I have published them in a book called Losing Ground, among others. But let's just see where we are for whatever reasons. First, we now have a new upper class that's different in kind from any new upper class we've ever had before. It is different in kind because it is not defined just by social position or money. It is also defined by a kind of cognitive stratification that has taken place over the last half century because of, I think, one of the most important phenomena that's happened, namely the increasing value of one particular skill set that goes by the label of cognitive ability. In 1920, high cognitive ability, if you were a farmer in Kansas, might make you a somewhat more prosperous farmer. It did not completely set you apart from the other farmers in Kansas. If you were an attorney, you made a good living, but you weren't fabulously wealthy. In every occupation, which in 1920 might make you a little more money or a little less money, in every one of those occupations, the growth in the economy, the changes in technology have made being really, really smart in those professions worth a lot more money. The most obvious example to me is the value of having really high visual spatial skills and no social skills whatsoever. In your math students, you occasionally see that kind of thing. Well, what could you do in 1920? You could teach math. What can you do now? You can juggle 6-figure offers from Google versus the quant hedge funds, who will then promise you realistically wealth beyond the wildest dreams of avarice if you go to work for them. But it applies to all the professions. So the professoriate, not so much, but the other professions it does. So that attorney who was handling the kinds of cases that people had in 1920 If he's a really able attorney, he has opportunities now that just didn't exist to make millions and millions of dollars and be worth it. If you are such a capable attorney that you can negotiate these incredibly complex international deals, you're worth a commission of several $1 million. The same is true of all the professions. You also had all the schools in the country, the elite schools, seeking out intellectual talent starting in the 1950s in ways they had never done before. So Harvard goes from being a place with a lot of rich kids and a few smart ones to a place with everybody smart and some of them are rich. And the same was happening with other elite schools. You've got a cognitive elite that has a distinctive culture all its own. They live together, and I shouldn't be saying they, because we're actually, most of us in this room, participating in this culture as well. We live in communities which are not only in the upper level socioeconomically, they are filled with people like us. Not necessarily people like us politically, but people like us in terms of our tastes and preferences. That's a very different new upper class than we've ever had before. And guess what? That new upper class has become deeply contemptuous of the rest of America. And that does reflect, that's one of the main things that was going on during the last campaign, I will say parenthetically. At the same time, you've had this very un-American new upper class, because Americans aren't supposed to think of themselves as being part of an upper class. Americans are supposed to say, hey, I'm just one of the guys, ordinary American, nothing special. At the same time that was happening, we had the breakdown of the white working class. I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal in 1993 called The Coming White Underclass. And the reason I could write that article was because I was looking at the numbers on illegitimacy, and I noticed that the percentage of white children born to unmarried mothers was the same as the percentage born to black unmarried mothers when Pat Moynihan declared the breakdown of the black family. And I also am a devotee of Pat Moynihan in his pronouncement that any society that allows large numbers of boys to grow to manhood without fathers is asking for and gets chaos. And I think that despite all of the many complicated economic and social factors that have played into the decline of the white working class, the family breakdown is kind of the source that was going to produce this stuff no matter what. And it did. So that pathologies that we formerly identified with the black inner city are now in small towns in Iowa, like the one where I grew up. You also have the well-publicized finding by Angus Deaton and Ann Case that you've had a huge rise in mortality over the 21st century among the white working class for suicide and for death by drug abuse and for death by cirrhosis of the liver. You've had an incredible demoralization in that. You now have, at this point, a large population of able-bodied white males, and along with a large population of able-bodied black males and Latino males, for that matter, who are not working and not looking for work, who are spending 2,000 hours a year on average, I am not making that number up, on a combination of Game Boys and television. They're basically working full-time jobs with games and with television, who are living off their girlfriends, who are living off disability, who are qualifying for other kinds of welfare benefits. And this is going to get worse, a lot worse, because we have now available to us in ways that are unprecedented virtual reality, whereby you can escape for hours on end into another world. I mentioned the hours that they spend playing with the Game Boys. Well, we're now talking about goggles where you're in a three-dimensional world. And you're having Robert Nozick's thought experiment brought to life about the experience machine, which Nozick asked, suppose you had an experience machine which was absolutely indistinguishable from the real thing, why would you not plug yourself into it? What's the reason that you would continue to live your more boring life rather than live the life of the virtual reality? Well, that has to do, the answer to that question has to do with the intrinsic value of your life and your human life as opposed to a simulacrum of it. That is not going to be a persuasive argument for large numbers of young men who are already out of the labor force, are not married, are not marriageable, and who are in effect adrift. And finally, in terms of where we are, I will add one thing about where we're going to be. And that is, we are looking at a job market over the next 20 years that is going to be radically transformed. You have Ryan Streeter here from AEI tonight, and he can, I think, confirm that in this opinion I am alone at AEI. And my good friends, the economists there, to a man and women, all say that this time is not different, that the Luddites have been saying for 2 centuries that technological growth is going to get rid of jobs. It's never happened. It's not going to happen this time. And I'm really sorry for them saying this because they're wrong, and they're going to be very embarrassed when they're proved wrong. But what we have now is qualitatively different in terms of the destruction of jobs. You already know about some of this. About driverless cars will be within a decade. There was the story in the paper just 2 days ago about the machine that is now being used in San Francisco that produces 400 sandwiches per hour. I don't mean just the patties, I mean the whole assembled sandwich. There you have McDonald's, which is going to, by the end of this year, substitute kiosks for cashiers in 20% of their restaurants. Okay, those kinds of things are sort of normal in terms of technological development. Driverless cars, that does mean 4 or 5 million jobs, so that gets a little bit scary. But what people are not thinking about, including my esteemed colleagues at AEI, is that artificial intelligence is finally making good on its long overhyped promise. And by that I mean you have a very large number of white-collar jobs that pay $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year, good salaries. They don't require geniuses in those jobs. They require people with an IQ of 105, a little bit above average, because there have to be judgments that are made that computer programs have not been able to make as accurately as people could make them, because there are too many subtle things going on. For millions of those jobs, those days are over, or about to be over, where the software, by any measure of productivity, is more accurate, makes the decisions better, faster, cheaper, etc., than human beings do. We are not talking about just lower menial jobs or even working class skilled jobs that are going to be taken away. We're talking about a hollowing out of the white collar job market. There is going to have to be, within the lifetime of most of the people in this room, a radical reconstruction of what it means to have a meaningful vocation. In one sense, that should be easy, because there are meaningful ways to spend your life that do not involve paid work. And I'm not just talking about childcare. I'm talking about that thing called social capital. My wife has not held a paid job since she stopped being a professor at Rutgers. She spends more hours working every week, I think probably than I do, with the combination of the Literacy Council, Friends Meeting, the Goose Creek Friends Meeting that she's very active in, the Town Council of Burkittsville, and half a dozen other organizations. She's working all the time, and social capital that makes the community run. We need lots more of that kind of work. We're going to have to think about a world in which men are starting to accept that that can be a legitimate way to have self-fulfillment, to have a sense of self-respect. And that's going to be a tough sell. Well, let me now give you a scenario that I think is the most probable, and that I think it will be conservatism's job to try to forestall. And that scenario comes straight out of Brave New World. Don't know how long it's been since you read that book, but I will just remind you. You have the alphas who run the world, and then you have these other classes of people who basically are taken care of, and they are also given free daily drug called soma, which in its description by Aldous Huxley sounds an awful lot like opioids. And they also have other kinds of amusements which are kind of comparable to the virtual reality that I'm talking about. So you have one small part of the population that is living meaningful human lives, and the rest of the population is sort of thrown away in terms of living meaningful human lives. That's where we are heading right now. And we aren't heading there in subtle ways, it's happening in very dramatic ways. How do we reform that? How do we counter that? How do we establish, as conservatives, as classical liberals, as people on the right, establish an agenda and a way of thinking about these problems that has a chance of being effective? Just a couple of thoughts. The first is that I think the conservative indictment of the advanced welfare state should be that it will foster that brave new world society and start to make it quite clear that the direction that we are heading and how easy it is for that to happen. As part of that, I think we have to start emphasizing the ways in which government policy has systematically ravaged the 4 domains within which people pursue happiness. The ways in which the family, which used to make you a respectable member of the community who could hold your head high if you were a guy who had a wife and children and was putting food on the table and a roof over their head. That made you all by itself, not only gave you a sense of internal self-respect, you got the respect of the people around you, and you were doing something genuinely important with your life. In all sorts of ways, the government says, no, that's an old-fashioned institution, it's patriarchal, other forms of family are just as valid, et cetera, et cetera. We have denigrated the importance of the traditional family with devastating effects. In terms of vocation, I don't need to go through all the ways. I just went through some of the ways in which people don't need vocations anymore. In terms of community, you have all sorts of functions of the community that have been taken over by the state in the name of taking the trouble out of things. Well, you know what? An awful lot of the stuff of life means taking the trouble to deal with these things, and by lifting those responsibilities from the community, they have vitiated the community. And faith, I do not need to tell this audience all the ways in which practicing your faith these days brings you into conflict with the government. A second thing that I think that we need to do is to return the stuff of life to communities in the same way the Catholic Church does. The Catholic Church has a very nice doctrine called subsidiarity, where everything is supposed to be done at the lowest possible level where it can be done, and is only bumped upstairs if there's a good reason to say that the local parish can't do it. And I think conservatives can start to make this case effectively in a way that was difficult even 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I will bring Trump into the picture once again in this regard. I was personally devastated by the number of people who vote Republican who are really happy with big government as long as big government programs that they happen to like. The number of dedicated Hayekians out there is way smaller than I thought it might be. However, an awful lot of what went on in that election is not only an expression of anger at the new upper class, it was also an expression of just let us alone to live our lives as we see fit. It's not put in formal terms, but I think the underlying support for that is reflected in the number of state legislatures that the Republicans hold, the number of governorships, the way that they have held on to seats even in these special elections. There is a very strong sense out there of hostility toward the government, and also just leave us alone to live our lives as we see fit. Another thing I think conservatism has to come to grips with is that the wealth has to be shared. What has happened in the last 50 years, when I talked about the increasing value of brains, is a new kind of unfairness. You know, it's one thing to say, that we have control of how hard we work and our persistence and our determination and the other personal qualities that allow us to rise in the world, because even though, yes, those are partly genetically determined, but they certainly aren't all genetically determined. There's free choice. I'm willing to defend all of those qualities as being ones which let you deserve the fruits of your labor. IQ ain't one of them. None of you, nor me, can claim any credit for how smart we are. We drew the long straw in a lottery. And we live in a time which is tailor-made for us. We aren't making all that money if we're working for Google or if we're working for a hedge fund because of our grit. We aren't doing it because of our determination or any other personal quality. Those may feed into it, but we would have never gotten there if we hadn't drawn the long straw in that contest. That says to me that when you have looked at the last few decades in which the increases in income have gone overwhelmingly to people like us, that even a free marketeer has to step back and say we are a fabulously wealthy society. There has got to be a way in which people who are working hard and trying to do the right thing are rewarded for those efforts and can live not just a life above the poverty line, but a decent life. I have made that case in a book called In Our Hands, advocating a universal basic income. And I will just say parenthetically, I also think that is the best way to revitalize American civil society because I don't want to add that on to the welfare state. I want the universal basic income to replace the welfare state, which is putting responsibility for problems back in the community big time. What I just said about pushing the stuff of life down to the communities would be accomplished by that in a way that no other government reform would be. I'm not going to press the universal basic income as the solution. What I am saying is that conservatism has to start talking about the importance of getting resources to people who in today's economy are disadvantaged in ways that are simply not their fault in any way whatsoever. There are reasons, as I look ahead to how we might deal with this, in which there is some optimism, some reason for optimism. I think that the changes in technology that we are seeing work very powerfully for more individual freedom and less role for the government. Think about Airbnb and Uber. Who would have thought 10 years ago that you could break the taxi monopolies? Couldn't be done. There's no way you get a city council to ever do that. Turns out you don't do it by getting the city council to pass it. You do it by just showing up and providing a service that becomes so popular that there's a political price to be paid if the city council tries to stop you. The same thing goes for Airbnb. We're just at the beginning of all sorts of goods and services whereby they're going to come on the market, they're going to be very popular, and the government's going to be very hard put to stop them. There are all sorts of other ways in which it's just becoming obvious that the government isn't needed anymore. One of the very first programs, federal regulatory programs, was the Food and Drug Administration, whereby you wanted to keep tainted meat off the market and you needed federal inspectors. Okay, in the early part of the 20th century, I'd make the case that that was a reasonable way to deal with a serious problem because there wasn't any other way to have knowledge spread quickly and effectively. Suppose you got rid of every meat inspector in the country tomorrow. And suppose that for some idiotic reason, Safeway decided to try to make money by selling tainted meat. Just how long would it take for that to be all over the internet? Just how long would it take before Safeway would declare bankruptcy and that its senior officials would be going to jail? 10 hours? You know, I mean, the speed with which all sorts of monitoring of things is now going on without the government's intervention, all sorts of ways of Uber again. Drivers rate the customers rate the drivers. All sorts of ways in which technology potentially can make possible all sorts of devolution of responsibility. There is, along with that, I think, a growing sense, a growing realization that the government is just simply incompetent in so many ways. Hardly anybody ever chooses to use a government service if they can get a private service doing the same thing, because the government service from the public schools on up is inferior. But I want to close by another task of conservatism that has nothing to do with those kinds of solutions and promoting those kinds of solutions, but something that I think conservatism needs to do, which is to ignite a civic great awakening. By a civic great awakening, I'm thinking of the religious great awakenings that played such a huge role in 18th century and 19th century and early 20th century United States, creating vast changes in the culture for the better. We've got to have something like that with regard to the new upper class, and I think it's conservatism that's going to have to take the lead. I don't have a recipe book for that, but I think that what has to be done is for us to start talking in a much more forthright way about things like unseemliness. Building a 20,000 square foot house is unseemly. It should be legal, shouldn't be made illegal, but people should start to govern their behavior on a sense of seemliness, which historically Americans did do. There has to be a full-blooded defense of the proposition that the people who are being ravaged by postmodern values are the most vulnerable among us. That the lucky people in this country are still getting married and staying married and having good families and all the rewards of those families. Marriage is alive and well in the new upper class. But it's the new upper class which refuses to make judgments about the virtues of the traditional family, which refuse to talk about the ways in which that is a major source of happiness, not only for them, but must also be a source of happiness for the people who they now feel contempt for. There has to be, and it has to be as well, put in nonpartisan terms. Because here's another truth that I think we can confirm from our own experience. There are a whole lot of people on the right who are feeling perfectly comfortable being members of the new class, the new upper class, who are perfectly comfortable feeling disdain for high school graduates doing menial jobs, who are disconnected from them, and who no longer treasure the kind of cultural unity that characterized American exceptionalism. We have to test the waters of how much allegiance there still is to a traditional American civil society in which communities solved their own problems, in which people dealt with issues, in which people gave of themselves without being required by anybody to do it. I would like to think that there is a good deal of residual affection for that civil society. When I have spoken to groups of very rich people, and I have talked about these issues, I've been happy to see heads nodding in the audience. And perhaps the best optimistic note I can use to close on, I'm not very good at optimism. It's not my competitive advantage. But this is a true story. I was at Harvard a couple of years ago. There is an AEI student group up there, and I was speaking to the student group, and I was told during dinner, we were at a restaurant, that the sponsors of the dinner were there. And so I went over to say hello to them and thank them. They turned out to be a couple, I would say probably in their mid-40s. He was, what else, a hedge fund manager who lived in Greenwich, Connecticut. I don't think they allow anybody but hedge fund managers to live in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's very concentrated. And anyway, they said to me that they had read Coming Apart and they had been very impressed by it. In fact, they had been so impressed about their isolation from ordinary Americans and the need to re-engage with the rest of America that they had sold their house in Greenwich, bought a place in a rural part of Connecticut, which was, blue collar and farmers and that kind of thing, bought a pickup truck. And I'm listening to all this, and I'm saying to myself, it was only a book, And then the guy said, with his wife nodding, "And we love it." Well, that's maybe the truth that we can finally convey. And as a resident of Burkittsville, Maryland, I want to say it too. To reconnect with ordinary Americans who don't have degrees from fancy colleges, who are not making $200,000 a year, is to learn once again what made America so special. Because the ways in which it enriches your life, the ways in which you are engaged in the stuff of life, dealing with real problems, with real people, are sources of deep and lasting satisfaction with life as a whole. If we can convey that truth to the American people, all of the disaster scenarios I have just mentioned can be forestalled. Well, thank you very much, and we'll do questions and answers.